A very good morning to you all. There's still one or two more to come, but we're running a bit behind, so we'll get things started. Perhaps some of them will come while I'm talking. When the efficiency unit moved in here 18 months or so ago, one of the things we tried to do was to create space where we could bring people together to share learning and ideas and to discuss how we could move on the improvement of public services in Hong Kong. And that was the idea behind the Idea Place: innovation, design, experiment and assessment, sharing together, not just within government, but between government and public. We didn't know at the time that we would be invited 6 months later to start giving support to the task force under the Commission on Poverty on the Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship Development Fund. It's an entirely new area of work for us within government. It's been a great pleasure over the last year or so to meet so many people already interested and active in the field. And one of the people that we were told about very early on was Rosemary Addis, who down in Australia had been in the lead in actually getting government to innovate in the way that it directed public money to try and help support innovation for impact in society. We've been very privileged. Last week we had a gentleman, Gary Sturgis, who earlier this morning I discovered is also on a board looking at good government in New South Wales with Rosemary. He had helped the efficiency unit a decade or so ago looking at ideas of outsourcing and public-private partnership, but has since been in the UK looking at the effects of public service reform in the 1990s, following on from sort of Thatcher and Reagan's idea of making government more business-like, and reflecting on that and drawing lessons and trying to map out how governments should be developing in future, and putting much greater stress on the need for experiments in innovation and experiments from which you learn, rather than huge programs with which people then invest a huge amount of prestige and faith and don't want to change them even if they go a bit wrong. Far more valuable is the carefully designed experiment, the sharing of the learning from it, to give you a more confident base to see whether what you're doing does actually have impact on the society, deal with the problems you're trying to address, and give you better ideas as to how government itself can move on and what better partnerships can be built between public programs and private philanthropy, private investors, to help societies become better at dealing with the difficult problems that we face. Yesterday we had Kevin Robbie, also from Australia, working with Social Ventures Australia, who have helped to put into practice some of the social benefit bonds, they call them, which are behind some of the initiatives that Rosemary has helped to start to direct funding into these kinds of experiments. But today, very pleased to welcome Rosemary to share her experience of working within government to set up innovation to help address social problems. Rosemary, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you and welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out on this sunny Tuesday morning to talk about social innovation and investment. As Kim said, I want to talk about what's influencing social innovation and investment, as well as give you some really practical examples from my work and what we've seen happen in Australia, but also what's happening globally, and what I think this means for the opportunities and challenges ahead. I should declare that as of about 3 weeks ago, I'm no longer working directly with the federal government as a public servant, but very much still working in the public interest in relation to developing these ideas and opportunities. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about what some of the trends are that are influencing the development of social innovation and impact investing, as well as talk in more detail about those areas. And please, this is a discussion, so if you have questions along the way, we've got time at the end also for some discussion, but would love to hear your views and also have the questions that you might have as part of the conversation. Impact investing and social innovation are useful labels, but they're not things that sit in nice, neat little boxes. And that's why I want to start today by talking about the global megatrends. This is something that most of you will have seen in various ways coming through the press and other things. And I'm proud that Australia's own CSIRO has been leading work on identifying some of the global megatrends that are affecting societies right across the world. In Australia, at a conference last week for the big pension funds and institutional investors, Geoffrey Robertson, the well-known human rights lawyer and barrister, gave a presentation, and he also talked about moral megatrends and what he sees as factors influencing the way that we live and work. And an example of that is the movement that's been started by people who are angry with Starbucks, for example, that even though they're technically within their rights to minimise their tax in the UK, people don't like it, and they've made their views known. Now, whether that will influence behaviour is yet to be seen, but we see people in Occupy Wall Street and other areas actually saying, you might be technically correct, but we're not happy with this as part of our society, and generating different kinds of conversations. All around the world, issues like the ageing and growing population and the technological change that we're seeing that makes new ways of relating possible are influencing the way we work, and also influencing expectations and the possibilities for how we can address social issues. And as Kim said, they're also affecting the way that governments work and the way that we think about the public sector and its role. I'm not going to spend too much time rehearsing all of these, but I think one of the things that's affecting a number of countries as well is this need to boost productivity and innovation. And we tend to talk about that in economic terms. In my view, that limits us because we don't use the whole canvas. We don't talk about it in terms of the whole of our society and the way the different sectors work. And I want to come back to that theme a bit later. The environmental issues have been front and centre, and in a way they've led some of the wave of discussion around how we want to do things, how we want to live, and how we want to also finance things. And we see green bonds from the World Bank that are AAA rated. We see long-standing tax incentives in countries like the Netherlands and other parts of Europe that have influenced where people put their money. I know that not all of the green funds have been a very happy story, particularly at the institutional level, but we have seen a wave of that in the last 5 to 10 years, which has changed the way that people think about their investments. It's also something that I'll come back to in the sense that most fund managers now would have somebody who knows about that stuff. They have someone who knows about climate change, they have someone who knows about green funds. That's a change from a decade ago. And I'd like to think that we're headed towards a world where in another 10 years' time, people also expect they should have someone who understands more of the social dynamic and social issues. So this is part of our context. And another part of the context, which I know is not as prescient in Hong Kong, but for a lot of countries, the growing gap between the demand for services and what governments can afford to, or in some cases are prepared to provide, is really growing. And these figures from Oxford Economics show that even in a small country like Australia, that gap's going, estimated to reach something like $54 billion by 2025, and across the G8 countries, about $1.5 trillion US. Beyond affordability and the conversation we need to have about role of government, it's just a fact that some issues have defied resolution. And we have tried lots of things in lots of countries, and yet we still have too many young people who are unemployed. We have too many people who fall out of employment and can't get back on and into the system, into productive work. We have people who are homeless, and a lot of these issues have been the subject of policy debate and great philanthropic efforts for decades, and yet we haven't really shifted the dial. So the question is, what can we do differently? The other thing that's affecting governments well beyond money is the expectations are changing. People have more power in their hands through technology, and they are saying, we want choice. We've got more information. We want to be able to have services locally in our communities in a way that makes sense for us. And there's a really important conversation that's going on all around the world about results and efficacy of services. For the most part, despite lots of fantastic intention and effort in government and in some parts of philanthropy and in the social sector, we're really good at measuring activity. We're often really good at measuring inputs. We're not very good at knowing what works, and we're not very good at measuring the things that might tell us whether we're actually shifting the problem. We're not very good at doing that even in terms of addressing the symptomatic issues, let alone getting to the things that might actually make a longer term difference and help people to participate and have a much more productive engagement. And these trends aren't just affecting government, they're affecting all sectors. Community organisations often get driven to where the money is rather than setting a strategy. If we were investing in a company, we'd be appalled by that. So where's your strategy? Show me how you're going to execute it. What kind of returns can I expect? And yet for community organisations, often they're not able to set that strategic vision of an impact they want to have, or where they do, they're still limited by cobbling together grant funding based on decisions that have been made elsewhere about what programs are going to get funded and why and how. A number of foundations across the world are seeking different kinds of options for how they work together, and different ways of having an impact. And investment and asset owners also face issues about diversification and about what they can do to be having a broader range of investment options, particularly post the financial crisis of 2008. Even though the market's getting pretty hot again now, you have a number of investors, and particularly in a country like Australia where our pension funds are very large indeed and are projected to outgrow the stock exchange locally within coming decades, there's a very real conversation about how do we create different kinds of investment options. And we see that conversation going around the world. There's also mounting pressure from some parts of the public where people look at some of these big institutional pools and start asking questions like, how can you invest in ways that's good for the community? And I'll come back to that point. And for government, that pressure to do more with less, the increasing social inequality in parts of our societies and the demand for services which keep rising, and particularly in core areas of education and healthcare, those issues aren't going to disappear anytime soon. So social innovation has been coming through to the fore in this context, but it's not new. People have done great things to create different ways of working across social issues for a really long time. Some of the examples that are up here, like carbon trading, fair trade, open universities, cooperatives, congestion charging, the World Wide Web, these are all examples we're familiar with, and some of them date back decades. I love this definition that actually comes from one of the academic journals, but basically just reduces social innovation to plain language, which says we're talking about solutions that are more effective, efficient, just or sustainable to social issues that we face. And I think it's important that we keep these discussions really grounded in the basics of what we're trying to achieve. And the question that I love to come back to is, to what end? If we're doing things, to what end are we doing them? And I also want to make the point that thinking differently about social issues is about solutions very much, and we see these trends informing a whole range of fantastic ways of working. For those of you who know the work of Bill Eggers, Deloitte partner, who is a leader in public sector innovation and reform, he's just published a new book and called it The Solutions Revolution, talking about how people are applying market-based mechanisms and the things that they know from different sectors to shift social issues and to create public good. And the examples are very prominent in some developing countries, but they extend to developed countries as well. Things like easing traffic congestion with rideshare initiatives. But the thing that I think is really important to remember too is some of this is about new market opportunities. When we look at the examples from around the world, you can actually see that there are areas where some of the innovations are actually driving new markets. And the Leapfrog Investments guys are offering micro-insurance products to people. And they look at that and say there's a range of people who don't currently have insurance, which is a social and economic benefit to them if they did have it, and they're vulnerable without it, and they can afford to pay, but just not very much. But if you do that at scale, they've been very successful with their funds, and to a certain extent, microfinance is about that same story. So one of the trends that we see is social and community enterprise, and I'm not going to spend too long talking about that per se, but we do see people really blending their business and operating models with a sense of purpose. Certainly across a range of countries you can see people coming through universities and business schools that want to talk about how they can actually have a much more joined up approach to how they make a living, generate economic benefit, as well as the things that they care about in society. And we see lots of great examples of social and community enterprises, some at the very local level, and there's a picture here of a school community farm, some in the environmental area with solar and other renewable energy sources, employment for people with disabilities, and certainly the competitions that are going on around the world to elicit some of the best ideas bring forward fantastic solutions that people are coming up with in sanitation, in energy, in clean drinking water, and in community-driven businesses that are creating employment and economic opportunity locally. But the global trends I talked about are also opening up this whole possibility of much greater contestability of ideas and networks, and in the sense that they enable you to reach more people and to get more ideas in the door, it also opens up how we can commission funding, how we can commission services from government, and how philanthropy can engage and how we engage across sectors. What's fantastic about the ability to use some of these new channels and to reach more people is the ability to actually bring solutions to the table, not just from people who spent all their time thinking about the problem, but from people who might never have thought about that problem, but have thought about a different problem and can apply their ideas laterally. So we see, for example, an example that I love, and it's from kind of the scientific area, but NASA optimised its calculation of dark matter by more than, I think it was about 200%, but more than it had for decades, by actually putting it out there that they were stuck, and somebody who had worked on glacial analysis, working out the matter of glaciers, applied his way of working to their problem and created a breakthrough that had defied them for decades. And what we see now is governments using this. In the US, there's a site called challenge.gov, and government departments from right across the spectrum, from Defence and NASA through to their social service areas, saying, we've got an issue and we're not sure that we've got all the answers. We'd like to get your ideas, and running competitions. In a way, this is a variation on process governments use already. We're great at using expressions of interest and other things, and I think it's a fantastic thing to look at how would we actually use some of these new channels to bring ideas and new combinations of people to the table than we have previously. I did hear that in the US, they've in fact created a wiki site where you can wrap legislation. Now, most jurisdictions aren't quite ready to go that far and create rap songs about legislation, but it's fantastic if you've got time to have a look, because the most popular rap songs on there are all to do with things that you would never pick. I think the last time I looked, was something to do with amphibian reproduction and classification of sea life. And so we see the international experience and evidence growing, and people working out how to do this. Some of this has been borrowed from the commercial sphere. Originally, scientific R&D companies realised that they could actually create value if they tapped into other people's R&D and not just looked at their own. And so you saw some commercial sites actually develop, and what they've done now is make those channels available to others. So one big research company might run the site that enables competitions to be run by a whole range of people saying, we're prepared to offer a prize for whoever can solve this problem for us. And obviously, depending on what kind of reward you're prepared to offer, depends on how much time and effort people put in to solving the problem. I was saying to some people, I've recently been setting up my new business, and I used a crowdsourcing platform for designing logos, 99 designs. It's great, 418 choices later, and a huge amount of learning for me in the process, but ideas from all around the world. And so in this world, the conversation about market-based solutions and how we can work together has also moved to how do we finance this work of social change. And the impact investing developments that we've seen really about focusing capital on intentionally resolving social issues as well as providing a financial return. The term impact investing is fairly new. It was coined in about 2008-09 in connection with a forum that was hosted by the Rockefeller Foundation and linked to some work that the Monitor Institute was doing. And the name's kind of useful, but really it's at its heart about intentionally seeking to have these positive impacts. Why do we need to do that? In my view, it comes down to a fundamental choice. We can either accept that there's not enough money for governments and philanthropy to address the social issues and that we're constrained by that, or we can say there are much larger pools of capital and how do we want to try to access some of that where it's appropriate to do so for all of the stakeholders to try and create a shift. It's also about a shift in how we see these social issues, and I want to come back to that in a little while, that we accept that we need capital markets to actually enable a whole lot of other enterprise. Why do we limit ourselves in relation to the social sector? I've also put up here a little bit about the role of government. In my view, government has a role as a market participant, but also as a steward of market development. That's not particularly controversial when we think about the role that governments play generally. Treasuries issue bonds, they're a market participant. They also set the regulatory framework within which the markets operate. And impact investing can help to address some of those needs that we identified earlier right across sectors. It's not a silver bullet. There are no magic answers. Ultimately, like everything else, finding solutions to social issues and working out how we're going to put petrol in the tank in order to finance that work is hard work. No doubt about it. We won't always get it right. But if we can find some areas where it works, the opportunity is to increase the funding and financing options for community sector organisations, and in the process, hopefully, introduce some different disciplines and some ways of working for those organisations that helps them to be more sustainable. For investors and asset owners, there is the prospect that we can create some further diversification in options. For philanthropy, in my view, there are real options to punch above its weight, and for government, there are opportunities to work out where we can better target and leverage some of the funding, but also how we use these mechanisms and working differently with different combinations of actors to sit down and problem solve together and to introduce greater accountability in terms of results. And there is some evidence developing that these approaches can work. It's not a perfect data set yet, and those funds that have called themselves out as impact investing often have long tails if they're investing in equity, and we don't have all the results in. But we can point to examples, and I've got a couple here. This graph is from Pacific Community Ventures in the US, and you can see that the blue is their jobs growth, or the jobs growth through enterprises they've invested in local communities in California relative to the Californian and national averages in the US. The new research from Jed Emerson, Kathy Clark and Ben Thornley that looks at the top performing impact investing funds really calls out the discipline in those fund managers that you would expect to see in any robust investment proposition, and it identifies some additional things that they do in order to create their social and environmental impact, including that they work well across sectors on 2 dimensions, that they've worked out how to work with government and policymakers, and that they have what these guys have called multilingual leadership. So they can have robust conversations that actually tap into the needs and interests of people from different sectors. So I want to talk about an example of what we did with this in the team I was leading in Australian government. We looked at all of these developments, and there's not yet in Australia a uniform policy or even a cohesive policy around social innovation and impact investing, but I was very fortunate indeed to be given quite a lot of flexibility about what we might do. And we looked at things like Pacific Community Ventures and Bridges in the UK, some of the work that others were trying to get off the ground, and said, wouldn't it be great if we could do something like that in Australia? In the budget environment that we had, we couldn't quite work out how to actually get a program or some funding at that particular point. But sitting down with some players from other sectors who were really interested in this, we managed to say, well, what can we do? What can we do is we can actually pull together some work that will say what are the results internationally and what could we do here and what might it look like to shortcut the process when we got to a point where maybe we could do something. So we made an arrangement with one of the big 4 banks in Australia, the National Australia Bank, with an investment house, JB Weir, and with one of the large non-profit organisations, Mission Australia. And I led the initiative out of our department, and we designed a piece of research to actually say, here's a literature review of what's happening around the world, here's the key elements of how we think that could translate into Australia. And the 2 volumes have the literature review and then what we called a design or building blocks document. What would you need to actually do and work through to make it work here? And we published those documents, and what we found too was if you did really robust work on pieces like that, but then it really wasn't a big ask to go to ministers and say, we've done this, would you like to provide a forward and would you like to sponsor this work into the market? They didn't have to adopt it as government policy. They could just say, we think this is an important conversation. And so we launched those with the blessing of the minister at the time and with his forward in the front saying this is why we think this is important. And we still don't have a fund yet in Australia, but the conversation has shifted. And what we found is people who I never imagined when we started this piece of work have wanted to have a conversation about how we work locally. People from skills councils have come and said, can we talk about how we start linking up the pathways for young people into jobs with this kind of thinking? What I found to my surprise was that it went to the board of Big Society Capital, who said, let's think about how we talk about and frame the policy for this. And so there can be incredibly powerful ways of working in terms of shaping the debate and engaging people around it that can spark innovations in their own right. And the point I want to make about that is that not all of the work to try to promote and grow this market or find the solutions has to be high cost or high energy. There are often low cost, low resource intensive things that can be done that punch above their weight in changing the conversation and getting more people involved, and in what I call creating the pathways to possibility, saying this is what we mean. In Australia, and I don't know if it's the same in Hong Kong, in Australia people are very, very good about saying, well, that's nice that it worked in the US or it worked in the UK, but never work here. And they like to think that's going to be the end of the conversation. I like to think that work like this makes sure it's not the end of the conversation, that it's the beginning of the conversation about how could it work here. So having said that the early evidence shows that some of these approaches are working, it would be incomplete not to acknowledge that there's still lots of constraints and risks around it. Social innovation is still patchy, and in most places people have been joining up to really create a conversation, but it's not mainstream. It's not a mainstream part of the conversation. Impact investing is certainly not a mainstream part of the conversation, and part of that's because it's an early part of the market development, and I'll come to that in a second. But I also like to think that we can look and say there's nothing there, or we can look and say the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And as Kim alluded to, one of the great things about this is when you look around the world, there are people of the highest experience, intelligence, integrity, tapped into local communities, or working in major financial institutions who want to see how they can make this happen. And when we see developments like big banks like UBS, and in the last couple of weeks Goldman Sachs launching social impact funds, we know that something is shifting on the radar. So yes, there's lots of risks and constraints, and we should have a good discussion about some of those in our conversation and questions. Transaction costs are still high because most of the deals are still bespoke in impact investing, and indeed a lot of social innovations take lots and lots of grunt work, some of which never gets measured. We don't yet have the fantastic measures that we'd like, although I think sometimes that gets overcomplicated, and most people who want to be accountable for results find a way to do that. There are changing risks and changing ways of working and perceptions of risk because we just don't understand. So in the context of social impact bonds that I'll come back to, the conversation tends to centre on the risk to investors, and investors saying this seems risky to us. But if you talk to people in government, they actually focus on a different risk, which is we actually don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that we can do better than the results we're getting at the moment. What if we get much, much better results, and in 5 years' time people criticise that the government paid a lot too much to investors? So there's a range of dimensions we need to get better understanding of that. And so when we think about it, we're moving into a world where the global picture, and it's not evenly distributed, the global picture is that we're moving out of a stage of uncoordinated innovation into a stage of marketplace building. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are developing there as well. And when we talk about market building, that requires us to think about how are we going to address some of those risks and constraints. How are we actually going to overcome some of those, and how do we do it in a way that reflects the fact that most markets are global now, and a lot of these challenges are common across societies. How can we achieve things that have global reach and make sense with the global systems, but also have local relevance and are meaningful and appropriate to the communities where people live and work? I might just show the first of it. I've got a couple of very brief videos. So we're okay to cue the first video? That would be great. So this video that you're going to see now is my colleague Sandy Blackburn-Wright. Sandy is at the Centre for Social Impact in Australia.
Let's play a game. Let's imagine the money you earn working for you and everyone in your community. Now, let's also imagine the money in your super fund being there for you when you retire, and in the meantime, being put to work to make Australia a better place for everyone to live, especially those people who are doing it a bit tough. Okay, now let's imagine you can give money to charity and to social businesses that would do great things in community. And the ventures you invest in give you a financial return and a report on their social impact. Then imagine that instead of just monitoring the stock exchange for financial performance, you could also chart the social impact performance to make decisions about where you invest. Innovations in social finance are emerging throughout the world and in Australia. What this emerging market needs is more innovators to make imagination reality.
I think it is a great little video because even though it's the Australian context, it really captures what are we talking about here? What are we trying to achieve in a really vibrant way? And also, in the context of market building, that the thing we need to do most is we need to practice more. We need to work out how to do this. And so Sandy and her colleagues ran a marketplace in Australia the other week. People who walked in the door got money, play money, but they got money to invest. Enterprises were there and showcasing what they do. Some were funds, Some were smaller individual community and grassroots enterprises. There were rules, not surprisingly. If you wanted to invest in a fund, you had to invest all your money at once. If you wanted to invest in enterprises, you could split it up. One of the banks decided to play and they had a branch there. So the enterprises took their investment and they took it to the bank branch. And at the end of the marketplace, we saw where the money had gone. And it was very, very interesting. What was more important was it generated a whole lot of conversations. People had to talk to each other about what their enterprise was. The social entrepreneurs had to say out loud, this is what we're about and why we think you should invest. They were encouraged to talk to the investors, and if people said, this is all very interesting, thank you very much, but walked away without leaving some money on the table, they were really encouraged to say, so you think this is interesting, but what's blocking you from actually investing in my idea or my enterprise? The feedback that they got was that it was incredibly successful, and in fact there's already been approaches from a number of financial institutions about how they might run something like the marketplace. The idea being we need to practice more and work out how to do this. So another example from the work that I've been leading in Australia. In Australia, up until a couple of years ago, in fact I think it was the end of March 2012, that I convened a group of people and we'd just completed some initiatives, including a social enterprise fund I'll talk about a bit later. And I said, then what's next? What can we do? I'll put the arms and legs into it for 6 months. What can we do to take the market the next step? And I found that for people really dedicated to this market, they were still, had so many organisational and other priorities, it was really hard to shift it. People felt they were talking about these things, but they didn't know what to do next. They were still busy always talking to other people about what the market was. So we had the idea that we could run an engagement initiative that would try and ground impact investing in Australia, where we could say, what is it? Where does it sit globally? What's actually happening here and what needs to happen here? And me and Philo have done a similar thing in many ways with the Engage Hong Kong process. And so, similar to Engage Hong Kong, we used that in a way where we got people in to talk to us about what was occupying their mind. We created that focal point for the conversation and to collect that information and play it back. And now, when people are talking to new players and say, well, what is this all about? Instead of either doing what I used to do, which was stay up all night cobbling together emails to send, or feeling like they have to make the time for that, they just send them this. And it's enabled us to create a small step change where the conversation is no longer what is it, but what are we going to do about it? And again, we ran that from within government as a departmental initiative, so we weren't asking ministers to sign on to new policy or the whole palaver. That gave us a whole lot of freedom. We were respectful of that because so we didn't advocate a whole lot of policy change in the document. We treated it much more as a field scan. What's happening and what could and should be happening. And it does end with a call to action, saying we need to do more. The question is not just what is, but what should be and what should we be looking to do in Australia and with others in our region. And there's growing global momentum for this conversation. This year has seen some incredible watershed moments, and I think has the real opportunity of there being a step change globally in terms of social innovation, entrepreneurship and impact investing. And some of that's been led out of the UK, where they've been having this conversation for nearly 15 years now, so it hasn't happened overnight. It's been a process of engagement, and it's been a process for successive governments. A lot of the work that led the UK to where they are now was done in the period starting from 2000 or even before then. But we do now have David Cameron standing up and saying, we think this is important. We think it's important globally, and sponsoring some initiatives with the imprimatur of the UK Cabinet Office and their chairmanship of the G8 to say, how will we galvanise people and take this forward? I'm going to show you just another very brief video now of David Cameron and the words he had to say in London in June.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction. I don't know who it was who said, having heard myself being introduced, I can't wait to hear myself speak, but that is rather how I feel this morning. Of course, the last speech I made here at Bloomberg was about Europe, and I think it's fair to say it had a bit of an impact, and so I'm hoping today's speech will have an equal impact, because this is a very important subject. And it's great to welcome so many of the world's top social entrepreneurs and investors to London. This is, as Nick said, one of our first G8 events, and we want to put this squarely on the international agenda. As Prime Minister, I'm frequently asked to speak at conferences, but this is a conference I actually asked to speak at. In fact, I asked to have the whole thing set up, and today I want to tell you why. We've got a great idea here that can really transform our societies by using the power of finance to tackle the most difficult social problems that we face. Problems that have frustrated government after government, country after country, generation after generation. Issues like drug abuse, youth unemployment, prisoners being released and endlessly reoffending, homelessness, even global poverty. The potential for social investment, I think, is really that big. So very simply, I want to make it a success here in Britain, and then I want to sell it all over the world. So how does it work? Well, I think the simplest way to think about it is this. Businesses need finance to grow and to make a profit. Governments need finance to fund big infrastructure projects. That's why we have banks, bonds, investment markets, and all the rest of it. The idea here is just as simple and just as powerful. Social enterprises, charities, voluntary bodies, they often have the knowledge, the human touch, the personal commitment to succeed where governments so often fail. But they need finance too. Now, they can get it from socially minded investors, so we need social investment banks, social investment bonds, and social investment banks.
And what's important about that is that out of that has come a number of initiatives that create some structure for the conversation, that help us identify the common threads and again work out how we can get some global reach in the systems and also then apply it for local relevance. I sometimes like to think that governance is kind of like the stealth weapon of change. If you set up the right systems with the right people around the table and you support them with good governance, often it creates a framework that you can do lots of stuff. And it also creates something that other people can see and touch and kind of poke and do the Doubting Thomas thing around. And again, if you've got the right people, that can have an incredible influence. So the Social Impact Investment Task Force that was set up out of this forum that's chaired by Sir Ronald Cohen, that many of you will have heard of, who's been, again, leading a lot of this dialogue for about 15 years and has membership from 6 of the G8 countries. So far, Japan and Russia are not at the table. And the EU has been invited to participate, and I've been delighted to also be invited to participate. And what I think that we need to do from there is broaden the conversation. And certainly when we talk to people in the US and the UK, that's what they're really keen. They don't see this as an end, they see it as the start of a conversation. They've had the opportunity with the UK's leadership to launch something that gets this global conversation going and having some structure and governance around it. And the immediate question is, how do we broaden it from there? And that's a conversation that I'd love to have with all of you. So we're seeing demonstrations right across geographies and political systems. And I'm really lucky in what I do to get to travel to a lot of places in the world. And I found myself at a forum about 6 months ago thinking, oh, the conversation here is the same. And then I thought, the conversation's the same. How many times do we actually have change happening in the world where you can go anywhere around the world and the conversation and the issues are the same? The particular problems or social issues locally might be different. The government, political persuasion or structure might be different, but the conversation is the same. That means we've got an incredibly powerful opportunity now for change. And these global institutions, which include the task force, also a global learning exchange, which was announced out of that G8 forum and is being convened by the World Economic Forum, who are saying we want to be part of this together with the International Policy Collaborative. And I've recently taken on a role as the initiative director leading the strategy for that. We have the Global Impact Investing Network linking together investors and bringing them together internationally for the first time earlier in the year. And groups like the World Economic Forum starting to talk not just out of their areas that traditionally deal with social enterprise, but also the ones that deal with mainstream investment, actually stepping into this conversation. A lot of this starts with problem definition. I'm not going to dwell on this, but I think coming back to that point that it isn't a silver bullet, there's a really good question about where you start and also the to what end question. And to me, all of that comes back to problem definition. There are lots of opportunities to pick some of those areas where we haven't shifted the dial on social issues and start there. Lots of opportunities where there are social organisations and government policies that are having good effect, but where we're just not going to get the reach, and start there. And that gives an incredibly powerful platform to whoever wants to take the leadership to say, let's talk about aged care. Let's talk about early childhood and bringing kids into the education system and giving them a great start in life. Because the investment and the money should not be driving the conversation, the issues should be driving the conversation. From starting with an issue or the problem definition, then you can say, well, what is it we need to achieve differently? Is it we need better outcomes, or we don't know? Is it we need better reach or better targeting? And you can actually frame up a whole conversation. And you can also start to think about a broader toolbox. How do we not only think of governments as grant makers and regulators, but how, from any sector, do we look at the ways that we can play a range of leadership roles? And we can talk more about that in discussion. I'm going to just talk briefly about another initiative that we led, which is slightly different, because what's important is we started with the problem definition, that often program limits start and end with a particular trajectory in terms of time frame or age or communities. And even if they do great things, often you don't get sustained results for the kids, their families or communities if it's not carried through into other areas of the system. Great programs that deal with kids in primary school, and then there's nothing to help with the transition into secondary school, and you don't realise the longer term benefits. So we applied another way of working from the more economic sphere of incubation. And we looked at what would it actually take to have a more joined up systemic approach to create change in the long term for communities suffering the greatest disadvantage, starting with real agency and engagement for those kids and families, and building from the idea that if you work with kids and families early and stay for the long haul, if you work with them individually but with enough of them to create critical mass, you can create change in a community over a generation. And working from our group in government, we incubated that model, and it's recently been written up as a new model of networked incubation, bringing the right people and resources around it at the right time. But we didn't try and run it as a government program. We were able to auspice that from within government. We were able to auspice a whole lot of data and research to the table. But then we spun it out into an independent organisation to lead and run in the community. And that meant that we could also have a different conversation. The leaders of that organisation, the CEO, can go and talk to people right across government and at different levels of government. We needed to think about whether government would support it, but we'd never wanted it to be solely government funded, because it becomes too dependent on the cycles of policy and government change in Australia. And so we looked at how we would tackle that, and we came up with wanting to try to promote a model of collective funding. Now, this is still more at the grant making than the investment at this stage, but it would be ripe later down the track for a social impact bond or for investment in enterprise and in training solutions. And we also had to have difficult conversations. I wanted to put some government funding into it to show faith with the community, because the investment we made in the incubation and coming up with the model wasn't that transparent to people whose lives are really hard on the ground. And we had lots of conversations where people said, well, this department shouldn't pay, that department should pay. And in the end, I was probably running out of patience, but I said, enough. Lots of people should. Lots of people should. The question is, who's going to go first? Because whoever goes first will create a virtuous cycle, and we were able, through a lot of good luck rather than good management, to get the minister's buy-in for that at the very end of the last government, and the government put in $2 million. What came with that, though, was the first community, which is in Northern Australia, that is a community that's very traumatised and suffers extreme disadvantage, but actually also has mining royalties, agreeing for the first time in Australia to put in their own money into their own solutions, and the community itself has committed, and they're standing beside us. And once we got those two pieces, the philanthropists came in with their first multi-year donations, and now we have a collective funding model. So what's great about social innovation is that you can move beyond some of these traditional kind of buckets we generally think about policy and action. And actually, I like to think of it as working in the gaps. Other people like to think of it as working in the intersection. But the point is you step outside of some of the usual frames that can constrain us. And the fact is, we actually do this in other areas of policy in the way that business, private sector and innovation works. In most countries that have systems around industry and innovation policy, it's actually well documented that government helps to set the landscape for the market, and government makes strategic plays of capital in order to bring the private sector to the table. The venture capital industry has been built on that. The OECD provides a questionnaire and scorecard report every year on that. So the question I have is, having done that for a long time in many countries in economic and industry policy, why again do we limit ourselves and not play with the whole canvas? Why don't we use the same types of approaches in social policy? We've started to in the environment, and you see initiatives like clean tech funds and other things, often with a bit of government money to prime the pump. But I think it's a great conversation, and some examples in Australia where we've started along that path, incentives for affordable housing, even some things in the arts which I think are really exciting. And this is about looking at the whole of the market dynamic and the market framework, but also thinking about the role of government in innovation. There's lots of literature and lots of smart economists who know more about the economic dynamics than I do have written about this and about how government can play in that space without distorting markets. And what we see is new partnerships emerging and different ways of working too that disrupt some of the traditional investment models, which are really exciting. So what we see sometimes is government and philanthropy actually taking on the most risk, but instead of demanding much greater financial return, what they're trying to do is bring other people to the table. If we think of project finance, that's quite a disruption. Normally, further down the tree you go in terms of the security of your investment, the higher the risk, the higher return that you expect. But in some of what we're seeing in impact investing, you actually see that being turned around. And what does that bring? It brings new ideas and resources, networks to the table. It brings new opportunities to the table. And it also creates opportunities around which we can sit down and work out how to make this stuff happen. So we did that in Australia with the social enterprise funds. There's lots of ways we could have spent the $20 million that we had in Australia for social enterprise investment and development, lots and lots of ways. And while I'm in no way suggesting that that's not a lot of money, in government spending terms, it's relatively small. But what we looked at and said, there is this market emerging, how can we use this as an opportunity to really create a catalyst? How can we use it to prime the pump? And so we offered the $20 million into the market as first loss funding in one hit, so a grant, basically free money, to seed fund new investment funds that would offer finance on appropriate terms to social enterprise. And we said to the market, we want you to achieve two things. Our key objectives are more money at the right time for social enterprise on commercial but appropriate terms, and we want to see building of this market and testing of this market for impact investment in Australia. And so the only things we're going to designate is that you have to show us how you're going to work towards those objectives, and we want you to bring at least one-to-one leverage to the table. But beyond that, you tell us. You're the fund managers. You tell us what your funds are going to look like. Tell us how you're going to do it. Importantly, tell us who's going to do it, how you're going to execute it, and we want to see real social impact as well as financial discipline. We got 13 proposals, 2 of which were completely barking up the wrong tree. They were grant proposals. So we had 11, and we shortlisted down to about 4 initially, and then we worked intensively with them. We wanted to see the commitment. We were open to talking to their funders. We had a real interest-based negotiation with them. We drafted up the kind of agreements we thought would be needed for cornerstone investments and said, we want to know there's no showstoppers before we agree to go forward with this, because a lot of sector goodwill depends on it, and because we need to make sure we've run proper process from the government side. And we ended up seed funding over a period of 6 months 3 new funds into the market. CEFA, Social Enterprise Finance Australia, was a new market entrant with some really interesting collaborations, including Triadis, the world's leading sustainable bank, made their first Australian investment. Foresters Community Finance, it was an existing community finance player, but they brought a pension fund or an institutional investor to the table. And Social Ventures Australia, who some of you would have heard from Kevin Robbie yesterday, that brought a lot of high net worth individuals and philanthropic foundations investing from the corpus of their investment capital. And so, as I said, how it worked was you had the investments going into the intermediary funds. Those funds now offer finance into the market for social enterprises. They have to report on their impact, but we didn't say this is exactly how you have to do it. What we said is you have to develop impact reports that the government's happy with. And we reached the view that it was much better accountability and transparency to say you need to actually report publicly than that you need to report to government. You need to tell the whole world what you're doing and how you're doing it and what you're achieving in the process. It would be incomplete given the rapidity with which social impact bonds are spreading and the fact that some of you heard from Kevin recently not to talk about social impact bonds. And in Australia, New South Wales government, so a state level of government, has issued the first bonds. They're the second in the world to actually get them into the market and sell them successfully, and they have put in a lot of work. There's no doubt about it. Social impact bonds take a lot of legwork and a lot of hard development work to actually get to market at this stage of their development. The 2 that have gone to market in New South Wales relate to out-of-home care. So kids that are in the care of the state because for one reason or another they can't live safely with their families. One bond relates to a program that is targeting reuniting kids to live safely with their families, particularly through working with the dads. Another program relates to trying to keep kids out of care in the first place. What's interesting from a much more kind of mundane and financial perspective in terms of out-of-home care is the costs are are relatively linear. There's a fixed cost of children going into the care system, and it doesn't have some of the characteristics of, say, the Peterborough in terms of recidivism, where you have a certain level of fixed cost where people don't go back into the prison system, but then there's another level of cost that actually you don't reduce until you achieve a critical mass of reduction, because you've still got to pay staff and you don't close a whole wing of a prison for quite a long time. The way that those bonds have been developed, it's interesting to see the shift in the conversation in New South Wales Treasury as well, where I think, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying, they've gone from having much more emphasis on cost savings for government at the beginning of the process to now much more emphasis on what the process has taught them in terms of outcomes, their own systems, what was and wasn't there, and how they've been able to work with other sectors and the discipline that's brought to the process. It's also highlighted that no sector's there yet in terms of some of their capability, and the not-for-profits have had to hire in additional expertise, particularly financial expertise. The government has had to work out how to pull the pieces together. There's been some very difficult conversations about data and measurement and how to do this well. Not-for-profit organisations, even larger ones who thought they had systems in place where they were looking at outcomes and results, actually found the system wasn't working that well once they started to dig in. So everybody thinks that they've got value out of that development process, even though it's just the beginning in terms of the actual service delivery. They also say it took much more hard work than they imagined at the beginning. It took longer to achieve than they imagined at the beginning, and that they've learned a lot as a result. In Australia, we're seeing other state governments start to put their toe in the water, particularly the South Australian government and the Queensland government, and there's a real conversation about where this links to commissioning. Kim mentioned Gary Sturgis, who was here last week. As he said, Gary and I sit on the New South Wales Government's advisory board, and one of the things that's been highlighted by him and other seasoned, very seasoned senior public servants is often when government contracts by results, there's a nervousness about the risk that the outcomes won't be achieved. And one of the things we do, and this isn't unique to government, it's just kind of human nature, is we often conflate accountability and control, right? We think we're going to get better accountability if we dive in and control, and if we want more measures and things. What that does is it takes people off course. One of the main benefits about social impact bonds is that if you're focused on the outcomes and you contract for the outcomes in a way that the money flows accordingly, that you actually give the service providers the flexibility in the middle to be adjusting the way they deliver if it's not delivering results. So in Peterborough, for example, we know that they've made lots of service adjustments. They thought people needed to be referred to service provider A first. They actually found, no, it works better when they're referred to service provider B. Because the focus is just on achieving the outcomes, they've got that flexibility. And one of the things that social impact bonds do, at least in the short term for us, is they create the contractual structures that's a bit more hands-off during that period of the bonds, because investors aren't really going to wear people going in and meddling with what the rules of the game are during the period. And I'm sure that some of our guests will have experience from the US to add to that as well. And this isn't up there for, I know you won't be able to read the slides, but what I want to point to is that practice is starting to emerge. For any new field or market to develop, we need to develop practice. Eminent strategy firms like McKinsey have written learned papers on the practice of practice. We do need to help synthesise the learning to make it easier. Otherwise, we don't get those on-ramps that people can play and we don't get critical mass. And so what we're starting to see is the emergence of practice. And again, that tells us the market is moving. People are actively looking at how we'll develop that practice around social impact bonds. And now we've got a discussion about development impact bonds as well. The analysis of the funds is small, but it's a start. We've got policy frameworks emerging, both in relation to impact investing and in relation to social innovations more generally. And we've got a leadership emerging who are saying, we'll help lead this conversation and bring others along so that we can help practitioners work out what works, so that we can engage leaders in the conversation, and so that we can make it easier for new people coming in to participate. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my formal remarks and ask that we open it up for questions and discussion.